Okay, so the first presentation is on critical milestones in infant formula development, how close we are to breast milk. Let me start with this quote. If breastfeeding did not already exist, someone who invented it today would deserve a dual Nobel Prize in medicine and economics. I presume all of you agree in this room, and if not, just have a look at this project of the Canadian medical students, which shows you what is the difference between breast milk and formula. And if the question is how close we are to breast milk, the answer is very clear. We are far, far away. This comes from BMJ. Formula milk is just a food, whereas breast milk is a complex living nutritional fluid that contains antibodies, enzymes, and hormones, all of which have health benefits. It contains much more, as you have briefly seen on a previous slide. So as a consequence, we all agree that breast is best. We are at the ESPGHAN meeting, so please allow me to remind you this position paper, commentary and position paper by the ESPGHAN Committee on Nutrition published already a few years ago, which fully supports breastfeeding and says it's a natural and optimal way of feeding infants. 50% is a World Health Assembly 2025 target, but exclusive breastfeeding rates among children under 6 months of age are well below this target, as you know. Not all countries are equal, however, worldwide, it's approximately 41% when you look at the exclusive breastfeeding rates by region in 2018. So there's a lot for us to be done. But then the question is, was there ever a golden age where every mother breastfed? And we know that it never happened. As a matter of fact, there were various possibilities. I will just briefly touch on some of them. And this was, of course, wet nursing. Wet nursing, which was practiced for centuries, began as early as 2000 BC and extended until the 20th century. And it evolved from an alternative of need to an alternative of choice. Paris, in the 18th century, it was called a city without babies. And the reason for that was that approximately 90% of infants were wet nursed, and infants were mostly sent away to live with their wet nurses in the villages. So that's why it was called a city without babies. There were various options that people were exploring, like in ancient Greece, infants were fed wine and honey. Of course, milk from and other mammals were used, from cows, from sheep, from goat. And also on this slide, you can see how people were trying to deal when it comes to the feeding devices. So my summary number one is there was and will always be a need for human milk substitutes, no matter how successful the promotion of breastfeeding is. But the truth is that few infants survive until infant formula based on cow's milk with added water and carbohydrate were introduced. And the history, one can say even short history of infant formula started only in the end of the 19th century with this German chemist, Justus von Liebig, who created soup, so-called soup for infants, and it was a formula, the first kinds of formula, the composition of which was based on analysis of human milk composition. He was a chemist, and he needed this kind of feeding for his grandchildren because his daughter was unable to breastfeed. So this is how the history of infant formula, in a way, started. On this slide, you have seen, you can see the development of infant formula in the 20th century and the 21st century. So their development included that people were considering protein content in formula. You know that cow's milk, there's a 3 times as high protein content compared to human milk. Iron fortification was introduced, renal solute load were considered, weak casein ratio was eventually similar to human milk. Taurine fortification in the 80s, the addition of L-CPUFA, long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, nucleotide fortification, addition of lactic acid-producing bacteria, later probiotic bacteria, and in the 21st century, reduction of formula protein content, because we are talking a lot about metabolic programming. GOS-FOS, we are at the symposium organized by Nutricia, and Nutricia is known for introduction GOS and FOS, galacto-oligosaccharides and fructo-oligosaccharides into infant formula. More recently, there is a lot of discussion about human milk oligosaccharides, and last but not least on postbiotics. When we are talking about the development of infant formula, there are two approaches which I very briefly will summarize. It's matching human milk composition or matching breastfeeding performance. And of course, composition has an impact on the performance, on the outcomes. But let me start with matching human milk composition at what are the challenges. And there are many challenges, so just some of them. First of all, human milk is a complex body fluid that is variable, not only among individuals, but also within an individual over time. So this is really a challenge, and some people like Lonnerdahl and Ole Hernell, both members of our society, published some time ago in Journal of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition the article and the comment, and they were suggesting staging of infant formula. Part of the reason for persisting differences between breastfed and formula-fed infants, both during infancy and with respect to long-term outcomes, is the present static approach to infant formula feeding, in their opinion. And therefore, they suggested this three-stage for infant formulas, which is different compared to what we have in Europe at the moment, that we have two stages. But in the United States, as you know, there are no staging at all. But the future innovation might be that we may have or may consider even further staging. So this is what was the position of these two prominent members of our society. Another challenge is that human milk contains components such as live cells, stem cells, and bioactive compounds that either cannot be added to formulas or cannot survive a shelf life. Another challenge includes potential negative interactions if some, but not all ingredients found in human milk will be added. Example is that large amounts of iron without adding adequate antioxidants. Metrics can highly influence the bioavailability of nutrients. We know that, for example, bioavailability of iron from cow's milk and from human milk is different. So this is something which has to be considered. Another challenge, the occurrence of a substance in human milk alone is not considered a satisfactory justification for adding to infant formula. Examples include taurine, nucleotides, lutein, gangliosides. All are safe, but relevant benefits remain unclear. Another challenge, any change from an established practice may carry risk. Examples, infant formula deficiency in chloride, and this resulted in the development of hypochloremic metabolic acidosis, growth failure, some degree of impairment in mathematical and language skills. Another example from Israel a few years back, soy protein formula deficiency in thiamine, and resulting in lactate acidosis, encephalopathy, death, and later abnormalities in language and mental development. Another challenge, innovations may be very expensive, and therefore infant formula will become less affordable to some populations. So they will be potentially available, but some people will not be able, some children will not be able to benefit. So these are challenges for matching human milk composition. There are also challenges when we are speaking about matching breastfeeding performance. Infant formula should be based on the comparison of outcomes in exclusively breastfed and formula-fed infants. So not only composition, but also outcomes are important, physiological, biochemical, functional. But the challenge is that not all of the advantages are necessarily attributed to the nutritional content of human milk. Another challenge is when it comes to clinical trial significance, statistical significance versus clinical significance. What is a minimal clinically important difference, which is really fundamental to all clinical trials, because very often we see statistically significant difference, which clinically is absolutely irrelevant. So this is important for the discussion when we are speaking about a development of infant formula. So my summary number 2 for this part of my presentation is the composition of human milk provides some guidance for the composition of infant formula. However, compositional similarity is not a sufficient indicator of the safety and nutritional adequacy of infant formula. Infant formula should be evaluated based on the comparison of outcomes in exclusively breastfed and formula-fed infants. However, please remember, not all advantages are necessarily attributable to the nutritional content of human milk. When we are speaking about the development of infant formula, regulatory issues are also important. I'm not an expert in regulatory issues, but all of us are aware on Codex Alimentarius, which has a vital role when it comes to the composition of infant formula. Here in Europe, important for us is EFSA, European Food Safety Authority. This is one of the latest scientific opinion on the essential composition of infant and follow-on formula. And what will happen in Europe since February 2020, that the addition of DHA will be a mandatory addition to all infant formula. Some of you know that controversy exists, and again, some members of our society commented on it. Bert Kolecko and Hans van Hoodover, then should infant formula provide both DHA, both omega-3 DHA and omega-3 arachidonic acid? As I showed you, this conclusion made by EFSA was that it should be only DHA. When we are speaking about regulatory issue, it's not regulatory, but the huge contribution when it comes to the composition of all knowledge on infant formula is coming from ESPGHAN Committee on Nutrition. If you are interested in this contribution, this comes from the jubilee issue of JPGN, but you can follow the history of the ESPGHAN Committee on Nutrition. And many members of our society had the privilege to contribute to this work. One of the most recent papers published by the ESPGHAN Committee on Nutrition, and Mary Future was at that time the chairperson, is this one on palm oil and beta-palmitate infant formula. So I think that really the Committee on Nutrition and this society as such really contributed to the development of infant formula. And this brings me to optional ingredients in infant formula. And current research efforts focus on metabolic programming and the potential impact on infant gut microbiota. The latter one is in the area of my research interest, so allow me just to show some of our contribution to this field. Few years ago, there was the ESPGHAN Committee on Nutrition paper on the infant formula supplemented with probiotics and prebiotics. I had the privilege to contribute to this paper, but it was published already in 2011, and new data were published. So together with my colleagues from my team, we recently updated what is known on infant formula supplemented with prebiotics. And as you can see on this slide, many prebiotics were evaluated. Among them, the most commonly it was a mixture of GOS and FOS. And if you look at the main clinical findings, you will see that there are some positive clinical effects. The one which was really in all trials, it was stool softening. What I think is extremely important, particularly in the context of the discussion that we have on the overuse of antibiotics and long-term consequences, is decreased use of antibiotics in some of the trials. Our summary from this paper was there was no safety concerns with regard to growth and adverse effects. Some favorable clinical effects are possible, and I already showed it to you, and the efficacy and safety should be considered for each prebiotic supplemented formula. Very similar findings were when we were evaluating infant formula supplemented with prebiotics, limited data, not so many studies, but they were, again, decreased use of antibiotics is something which I consider important. Very similar conclusions, also similar to the ones that we made a few years ago together with within the ESPGHAN Committee on Nutrition. No safety concern, some favorable effects are possible, and the efficacy and safety should be considered for each probiotic supplemented formula separately. Infant formula supplemented with postbiotics. Postbiotics, in a way, they are known for years, but they are discussed again nowadays from different perspectives. Let me just briefly introduce the definition of postbiotics, and it's a working definition because people are working on it. And the one here given here comes from this booklet, The Biotics Family, which together I had the privilege to contribute together with Seppo Salminen and from Finland and Jan Knoll from the Netherlands. And here the working definition that we provided is that postbiotics can be defined as bioactive compounds produced during a fermentation process, including microbial cells, cell constituents, and metabolites that support health and or well-being. And I'm saying they are known for years, but we are looking from different perspectives, because previously we were more focused on the process, on the fermentation. Now we are more focusing on these postbiotics. And what is important, each bacterial strain used during specific fermentation processes results in a unique set of postbiotics, and you will hear a lot about it later on during this symposium. Another ingredient that is now discussed are human milk oligosaccharides. Human milk oligosaccharides are known for years, but they are discovered again. And you may ask yourself, what is behind this current interest in HMO? Advances in analysis of HMO, that's for sure. Progress in biotechnology, which allows to produce at least some HMOs to be added to infant formula. And finally, two important organizations, EFSA and FDA, confirmed the safety of 2-FL and LLNT when added alone or in combination to infant, follow-on, and young child formula. And as a result, we are speaking so much now about HMOs, those present in breast milk, and also those which are added to infant formulas. There is some evidence coming from published studies which are summarized on this slide. At the moment, there is mainly focus on tolerance, on growth, but there are also some reports on reduced parent-reported morbidity and medication use. And again, I call your attention to reduction in the use of antibiotics, again in the context that we are discussing this long-term adverse effects of using antibiotics. So this is important. Further trials are needed and are underway. So my summary number 3 for this part of my presentation is the addition of a variety of optional ingredients is generally accepted if there is an adequate evidence of their safety and indication of a benefit. And you will hear more in the next presentations. So where are we now? Current infant formula appear generally adequate and safe. Opportunities to further improve infant formula exist, because many outcomes in formula-fed infants are still not equal to those in breastfed infants. But it's not about ideas, it's about making ideas happen, but there are challenges, again. The development of modifications with documented effects on outcomes according to current standards is complex, is difficult, requires extensive research, and requires very high investments. So it's unreasonably to expect that innovations of relevance to occur in short intervals. It's difficult for academia independently, it's difficult for small and medium enterprises, feasible for large partners, requires patent protection. So there is a lot of challenges. And collaboration is needed. And again, allow me to come to this document which was published again in Journal Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition, which is on public-private collaboration in clinical research during pregnancy, lactation, and childhood. And this collaboration is really needed. And my personal view is that the best way to approach it is for EU-funded grants when the consortia is consisting of people from academia, from patients' organization, from industry. It's transparent. It's really something that, in my opinion, should be really further developed. This brings me to the end of my presentation, and I know the audience is likely to remember 3 things from each presentation or speech, at least, I hope. So my take-home messages from my presentation, I prepared it for you, are here. There was and will always be a need for human milk substitutes. no matter how successful the promotion of breastfeeding is. The composition of human milk provides guidance for the composition of infant formula, but infant formula should be evaluated based on the comparison of outcomes in exclusively breastfed and formula-fed infants. Opportunities for further improvement of infant formula exist, but breast milk is still the best. And allow me to repeat it again. Breast is best. Thank you very much for your attention.